Hello there, welcome to my review of the Rockford Files Season 3, Episode 14 and 15, The Trees, the Bees and TT Flowers, written by Gordon T. Dawson and directed by Jerry London. The episode begins at a funeral service for the TT Flowers of the title, where Rocky is giving a eulogy about the man and his humble life at his home on the edge of the ever-creeping city, before we transition into a flashback of how this all came to be. I'm not a huge fan of this flashback style opening, as I feel it's setting up for an obvious rug pull of some sort, and it's really just saving the time it might take to organically explain that Flowers is an old friend of Rocky's. But this episode quickly reveals it's going to be exposition heavy, as when we flash back we find TT telling Rocky about how his bees are under threat from the lack of trees and the neighbours in the new housing complex using insect repellent.
Old poison thumbs over there'll get him for sure.
Also that he refuses to pay his taxes.
You ain't paid your taxes? They're way overdue.
And that his daughter and her stockbroker husband are visiting to put TT in a home, all against his will.
You've got no right to stick me into that kind of a play.
TT is played by Strother Martin, a character actor with hundreds of credits to his name, but perhaps most recognisably from Cool Hand Luke.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
He's furious about this betrayal and refuses to go quietly.
Stop! This is my home! Hey!
And it's his emotional reaction that pushes Rocky to ask Jim to look into it.
All right. I'll go out and see TT at Horizon Crest in the morning, okay?
Thanks,
see what I can...
It's a very full-on opening that perhaps crams a little too much in too quickly, but on its face seems like a pretty clear case of elder abuse and manipulation of the system to get an old man put away as an incompetent. We also quickly find out that the doctor who authorised Flowers' admission, Dr. Christ, is crooked and plans to dope TT up so much that he appears to be out of his mind when the final assessment is made.
I want him paranoid and disoriented by 9 a.m. Friday.
They do an amazing amount of character work right from the off in this episode, with TT shown to be an animal lover who has neglected himself and his house in order to care for his bees, goats and chickens, and live as much off the grid as possible, including his refusal to pay his taxes, arguing that he's paid enough tax already, which is something of an alien concept in the UK, as our love of taxes is no different to those of you in the US, but here they are viewed as an annoying obligation rather than some sort of legalised theft, and that's the majority opinion. This makes TT, to me at least, a slightly, although not hugely, less sympathetic character in this respect. Stockbroker Sherman Royal can be immediately identified as a rotter, purely based on his profession, on both sides of the Atlantic. Flowers' daughter, Kathy, on the other hand, is shown to be attempting to do what's best for her father, but also making excuses for doing what also happens to be best for her.
Too bad you couldn't find a spare room for TT right here.
TT would not be comfortable here.
Not really wanting to care for her elderly and scruffy father in her expensive suburban home.
Sherm is top customers man at Reams and Fergus now. We entertain constantly.
It's amazing how with a few lines of dialogue and the right professions, you can quickly give your characters just enough depth to tilt the audience's sympathies one way or another. Jim cons his way into the old folks' home / hospital, having not seen TT in a while, so thinks that the drugged man is indeed as far gone as the hospital plans to demonstrate. While there, he's spotted, and on the orders of the villainous Dr. Christ, the orderly plants a leaking bottle of nitrous oxide in his car, which causes him to have a small crash. This turns out to be a foolish move, as he had just reported to his dad that Flowers was indeed as nuts as his daughter claimed, and he was done with the case. Now someone has tried to kill him, and he knows that Rocky was right in his suspicions. In order to test the system, Jim goes to see Christ, pretending to want the TT treatment for his own father, and finds out that Christ is more than affable to the idea, suggesting an attorney who will do the legal finagling. While at TT's place, called Freedom in a very unsubtle piece of allegory, they run into Royal, who is junking all of Flowers' possessions, and has some help from some construction thugs and their boss, Mullard, getting worked over for their trouble as Royal searches for TT's will. All of this moves at a lightning pace and quickly establishes that there is a clock running, and these guys are even more evil than first established.
I'll bet you're the Rockford had the car trouble today.
Matter of fact, I am. Who are you?
It's a really well done upping of the ante that continues when the cops prove to be no help at all. Becca doesn't believe that all of these guys are working together to do the old man out of his property. And even if he did, Jim lacks not only any proof, but it's not in Becca's jurisdiction. Becca is able to provide information that Royal was being investigated for defaulting on a huge payment, which gives him a motive but still doesn't help Jim gather any evidence. Jim then does some more digging into Mullard, finding out that he's got many crooked dealings in his efforts to transform Orange County into Concrete County. Finding out about this snooping, Mullard gives his goons the order to kill Jim, which really annoys him. Recovering at Beth's, he decides he's left with few options but to break TT out, and with some trickery, he manages it, just as part 1 of this two-parter ends. Part 2 kicks off with Jim, Rocky and TT escaping and planning to get the court judgment overturned. Unfortunately, this isn't enough for TT, who wants his home saved rather than the compensation for it being destroyed. So he takes off for Freedom, where he has a rifle stashed. With no rights, armed and desperate, the cops have surrounded Freedom, and of course Royal and Mullard are there too. Jim arrives and manages to talk his way in to see Flowers, but is unable to convince TT to leave. The cops are all ready to go in hot when Kathy arrives. Seeing the state this situation has left her father in, Kathy wants to cancel the sale of Freedom, and her husband, as well as Mullard's reactions, convinces her that something isn't quite right.
I don't want to see my father killed.
Kathy, let the professionals handle it.
No!
No, you don't know what you're saying.
He's right, Mrs. Royal. Why don't you let the men handle the business?
It's at this point that Mullard reveals himself to be genuinely evilly villainous. His villainy even gives Royal pause for thought when he plots to just kill TT to solve his problems.
The old man's gonna have a fatal accident.
Hey, Jack, I don't want any part of a murder.
This section of the two-parter feels much more disjointed than anything else in part 1, which had a much more cohesive story. The standoff is a little overly dramatic and overly serious, especially as it ends by allowing TT to walk away with just a fine and then return to his property. It's a bit of a low point in what has been, up until now, a solid and thoughtful piece of drama, and I think it fails to create the tension it desires to, and create a resolution to the ticking clock part of this story. This 20-minute diversion acts more like unnecessary filler than an advancement of the story. I think it would have been more emotionally effective to have Kathy convinced by the damage that Royal, Mullard and the construction goons have done to her childhood home and her father's possessions. And I think the writers knew this too, as after the siege has calmed down, TT suggests that Kathy take a look at the portrait of her mother that Mullard's goons have destroyed without thinking.
Why don't you go inside and take a last look at your mama's picture?
If this had been the turning point for her instead of the siege, and the episode had spent a little more time on the setup in part 1, it might have made for a stronger episode thematically. The plot does get over this hump and returns to a more congruous plot quite quickly, however, as Mullard's goon plants a bomb on TT's truck, which Rocky and TT plan to drive the next day. Royal is now blackmailed into going along with the plan, TT is declared sane, and Kathy is worked over by Mullard's goons for wanting to halt the sale of freedom. All of this causes Jim to spring into action and try to prevent Rocky and TT from taking the booby-trapped truck out, but failing and having to pursue them and Mullard, who has the remote for the bomb. Seemingly succeeding in a very tense game of cat and mouse, a remorseless Mullard makes his escape.
3 birds in 1 clip and nobody can prove it wasn't an accident.
But Rocky appears to be the sole survivor, taking us back to the funeral from the opening of part 1, where Rocky also announces as part of his eulogy that a new will has been found. Royal, Kathy and the crooked lawyer go to the reading while Mullard waits outside, only to discover that TT and Jim are alive and well. Ish.
Cheer up, sure. Can only get worse.
They reveal that Kathy knew that her father was still alive and has gone to the cops, along with TT. Further investigation has implicated Mullard, Christ, the lawyer and Royal in a long-running scheme to con people out of their homes.
They found out it was all one operation.
Each making a little bit of money at every stage of the con, with the police picking them all up as the episode concludes.
I hope they make you spend the rest of your life in one of your own places.
I have to say I'm a little disappointed with this 2-parter, but also like parts of it immensely. On the one hand, the first part is a tightly scripted, character-driven look at how just a few crooked people can craft an almost perfect scheme to con people out of their homes, purely for profit, while sacrificing nature isn't even a second thought. Unfortunately, this starts to crumble in the second part, where Flowers is shown more to be just a stubborn, unlikable curmudgeon, who, while not deserving this treatment, also does nothing to help matters, in fact making them worse. I do like the way it's set up at the start of part 2, so that TT will have his house demolished before they can possibly succeed in legally stopping it. This is a great motivation for him. I also like the way the level-headed SWAT leader is raked over the coals for not having gone in all guns blazing and wiping TT out.
I'm glad that you kept your head, sir, and I sure hope you can work out your family problem.
My SWAT commander may lose his badge because of the disrespectful way in which he handled it.
But this entire standoff section feels out of place, and makes TT seem less sympathetic and more unhinged. Also, by making the house and the land seem run down, it makes it less believable that he is just a simple man who wants to look after his plants and animals, and more that he just doesn't want to move. Had they shown that he takes pride in his land and keeps the parts of his house that hold memories of his wife pristine, it would have been more believable that he cared about what was being taken from him, rather than merely that something was being taken from him. They just can't quite get that character right, and the whole episode really rests on him. Meanwhile, They do a great job of showing how evil Mullard is in stages, and how evil Royal has become within his thrall, as well as how the initially unsympathetic Kathy is shown to actually be the victim of gaslighting by her husband, and is able to break free of his control. It's why seeing her still with him and Mullard after her father's funeral, after having been savagely beaten by Mullard's goons, is such a gut punch, until it's revealed that she was setting them up, showing an enormous amount of character to do so. It's a very frustrating episode as a result of these contradictions, despite having its heart squarely in the right place. And I don't think it's something that could be solved by reducing it to a single episode either, as the first part packs so much in. I think what it needed was a rewrite of the TT character and the first 20 minutes of part 2 as well. So for that reason, this is a 3 out of 5 from me. Thank you. Goodbye.